Welcome to the Open Apple podcast, where we celebrate the Apple II. Whether you're a long-time user, a nostalgic visitor, or a newcomer to the community, join us as we share news and memories of Steve Wozniak's most famous personal computer.
Hello and welcome to Open Apple. This is a very special episode 47.5 for June 2015. I am your co-host number one, Quinn Dunkey, and with me as always is my co-host number two, Mike McGinnis. How you doing, Mike?
I'm here.
Yes, you are, and harmonically so.
Yeah, so this is an interview, actually. Don't worry. This is not another Quinn and Mike comment on a TV show that you can't see or anything like that. But this is an interview between Matt Ownby and John Brooks, and I know the name Matt Ownby because he's the guy who did the Daphne Laserdisc emulator, which I think is very cool. And who is Mr. Brooks, Quinn?
Well, John Brooks is probably best known for Rastan on the Apple IIgs, which has got to be one of the best games ever to have existed on the platform. And this interview is really terrific. It kind of came out of the blue, actually. Matt had posted on Facebook that he had gotten in contact with John as a result of his work on the Daphne Laserdisc emulator, and they had some common interests there. I guess John had done some work on emulating Space Ace himself. They got to talking, and Matt decided to go ahead and record their conversation, and they got really deep into all sorts of technical stuff on the Apple II. They go into disk formats and reverse engineering disk controllers and copy protection and all sorts of wonderful things involving 2GS rendering details. So yeah, he recorded this thing and posted that he had the recording on the Apple II enthusiasts Facebook group. And so I got in touch with him and asked if we could air it on the show here. And he very graciously agreed to do so. So we're very excited to be able to do that. For the technical-minded Apple II folks out there, you're really going to love this. It's very, very detailed, very deep, and really, really interesting. So here we go.
How you doing? This is John.
Hey, John. How are you?
Oh, pretty good. Let me see if I can get the camera thing working here. Hold on. All right. So, all right. Not a great lighting in here, but hopefully it kind of works.
Cool. Yeah. I can see.
Okay. That's good. Well, it looks like you have lots of parts behind you.
Yes. Here you can see my Apple II disk drives, my old Apple II Disc 2, my file recorder.
All right.
My System Saver 2GS.
You get the whole collection.
Yeah. I'm actually in the basement here.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny how the wives usually don't like that sort of stuff up in the top of the house, right?
Yeah.
There's lots of stuff we can cover. I think kind of the question is, what do you want to start on first, and how do you want to go?
Well, before we start, you had mentioned that you suggested that I record this. Is that still okay with you?
Yeah, no, I think that's good because some of the stuff is not particularly obvious or easy to kind of figure out instantaneously as we go, so it might be useful to refer back to it for you.
Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and do that then.
All right.
So just a little bit more background about why I'm interested in the copy protection stuff is because I'm big into like preserving my memories from when I was a kid, and that's why I do the whole thing with the Laserdisc emulation and stuff. And I also was a huge Apple II and Apple IIgs fan, and I've noticed that all of the stuff that's been preserved out there is just like all the games that have been preserved are like the cracked versions.
Yep.
And no one has ever tried to preserve like the original copy protected versions. And I think, well, if we're going to really preserve the history, we need to preserve the copy protected versions, not just the cracked versions. I mean, because there were some really cool copy protection schemes, and back when those games were new, I was too young to really understand it, and so I'd kind of like to go back and just research and see exactly what they did for some of those old games. And yeah,
well, I can cover a lot of the different techniques and stuff if you want. So in like 82 or 83, I think it was, I created, so it was my first commercial program. It was called Dyson, Disun, and I just sold it in the classified section in the back of like Small Talk magazine and and was it Nibble magazine, and there was like all these enthusiast Apple magazines, and so it was just kind of it was one of the early Nibble readers, so I just read all the nibbles off the disk. But then I could scan it and display it to the user and let the user specify what the sector and data header and trailers were. Because in the original days, that's usually what people would do to protect their data, is they would just change the headers for the DOS sectors.
Right.
And then in that way, so all you really had to do to access the data was to change the headers, the like P58896 bytes that that DOS was looking for, and then it would just go ahead and read the data, and you could copy it to your own disks and get the data off.
Sure.
But anyway, but kind of through that process of, so that was its stated goal, but it was used a lot by people to, extract data off of protected disks because, again, the changes were usually pretty simple, and being able to see the nibble data, which later Locksmith and other packages did as well, was pretty useful just to see what was going on in the tracks. But as a result of that, I got to look a lot at what was happening with different programs and how they were changing the track and sector layouts and the sync fields and other kinds of things that made it harder to protect or harder to copy. But so you want to start with the protection stuff that Rastan used?
Yes, let's talk about that first.
Okay.
And let me tell you what I already know about the Apple IIGS type of protection. I know that most of the games either, like, for example, I don't know why I remember this, but The Last Ninja, I remember that had a bad block on block number 7. Mm-hmm. So you'd copy it, it would get an error on block 7, the copy would keep going, and then the game would boot up and check block 7 and say, oh, I can read this, that means it's a copy. So the bad block check was one of them. And then another one that was used by like a lot of the games, including, I believe, Marvel Madness, was they would check for a specific nibble signature on, I think it was like track 20 for some reason. They always check track 20. I don't know what was so special about track 20, but they would check for that. So you'd copy it and it wouldn't show any errors, but the copy would have a different signature, and that's how they knew it was it was a copy. And I remember that when your game came out, it seemed like, I actually don't know what the protection scheme was, but it just seemed like the people that were like trying to crack it had a really hard time with it. Like there was something special you did that really threw them off, and that's what I'm really curious about.
Yeah, well, it's really a cascade of a number of things. So in that era, most copy protection systems were the simple bad block check. And what I ended up doing was implementing the same kind of copy protection that we've been using at Datasoft on floppy disks for quite some time. So Datasoft had been making games for Apple IIs, Atari, ST, Amiga, Commodore 64. Anyway, so pretty much the whole breadth of the home consumer products, and they had customized copy machines that would duplicate the disks using different protection mechanisms for the different platforms.
Okay.
Anyway, and so the kind of gold standard of protection that was most desirable at Datasoft, if the platform would support it, was called floating bytes, or basically floating bits. And conceptually, what that was is effectively uninitialized regions of the drive, and so kind of going to the underlying machinery of what's happening on the floppy disk drives. So the disk has got a magnetic pattern to it, and when it comes from the factory, they're typically uninitialized, unformatted, and so the magnetic field is all one orientation. And then when the disk writes, when data is written to the drive, that single kind of polarity field gets written with sync bits, so that because the drive is spinning at different speeds on every different mechanism, every two different drives won't spin at exactly the same speed. So part of the challenge is trying to figure out where are you on the disk and where are the data bits, and in order to tell where you are and to kind of frame the data bits, you have clock bits. And so the old so the typical system was FM or MFM, where you basically have a clock bit in between every data bit. So effectively half of your drive is used just to give you your framing of your data bits. So in between any pair of clock bits, you'll either have a 0 data bit or a 1 data bit. Anyway, so of course that's pretty inefficient. And so what Woz did with the Apple II controller early on is he had this thing called group code recording, where instead of having just be 1010, that kind of thing, he allowed the 0 bit to sometimes be where a clock bit would be. So you still had to have every 0 ordered by a pair of 1s, but the 0 could be in more places, which meant that instead of only getting 4 data bits or 8 bits on the drive, you could get 5 data bits. So that was the 5+3 encoding that was on DOS 3.2.
Right.
And then later on, he changed the decode hardware so that you could actually self-clock in a clock bit if there were 2 zeros. So now a disk nibble of 8 bits, we had to start with a 1 bit, but in the middle, for the remaining 7 bits, you could have a pair of zeros somewhere in there. And what the timing circuitry in the read head would do is it would say, after a certain amount of time, if I haven't seen a 1, I'm going to assume that there's a second bit and that bit is also a 0. Anyway, and so by being able to get a pair of zeros, that gave enough additional combinations that he could get 6 bits of data in 8 bits of the drive.
Right.
But anyway, so what this floating bit protection system is, though, is it violates that requirement that you have only a single pair of zeros. So effectively, what the float bit protection system would do is it would write a real 8 bits of 0 to the floppy drive.
Okay.
So with the drive, with the magnetic medium, you could write whatever you wanted. You just couldn't read it back again. Because you had to have these clock bits in order to allow the drive to figure out where the data was.
Oh yeah.
So anyway, so what I did on Rastan was so every track had like a large sync field, and the sync field would be like 10 bits of data per byte that was read off of the drive, if I remember correctly. So it would be 8 1 bits followed by 2 0 bits. There'd be a sequence of like 12 of those or 18 of those or something. There was a certain number of them where regardless of where the head started reading the bit pattern, so if it read the 8 1s, because every valid data byte had to start with a 1, it would skip the next 2 zeros. So by having a 10-bit pattern of 8 1s and 2 zeros, it would force the head to eventually get to the proper alignment where it would read out FFs. There.
Okay.
So if it ever landed kind of somewhere, so when you seek to a track, you're going to start out somewhere in a random middle of the bit stream, right? And so a big part of what's happening with DOS and the drive and stuff is in order to find out how do I get from one of 8 possible bit alignments to the proper byte alignment I need in order to read the data. And so the sync field forced that. If the head ever passed over the sync field, the reading machinery would be forced to align to the proper byte boundary. Anyway,
that's on a properly formatted disk.
Correct. Yeah. So once you format a drive, really what the formatting is doing, it is going through every track, writing down the clock bits, writing the sync field, writing the sector header and trailer data, and then the sector data header and trailer data. So the other thing that was going on is that every track has multiple sectors on it, and those sectors are individually randomly writable. And so the way that was made to work is that every sector has a field of these sync bytes at the beginning of it. And so you could seek till you got to the right part of the track you wanted to change, and then you could write out your new data field. And even though what you're writing is probably not at the exact same bit alignment as the bytes of the other sectors, the sync field will force the head to realign before it hits that sector's data.
Right.
So every write has a sync field preceding it and then the sector header, and then the sector data. But anyway, that also means that a lot of the disk is lost. A lot of the actual storage is wasted with these sync headers per sector and the sector headers and sector data trailers. And so what I did on Tomahawk and Hunt for Red October had a single data sector per track. So I'd have I had the minimum sized sync field, and then I just had one sector that went the entire remainder of the track. And so I upped the memory size from 800K to I think 924K. So there was over 10% overhead in the way the track layout was structured. The other thing that was interesting about that is the sectors were interleaved with, I think it was a 4-to-1 interleave. So effectively, they would write sector 0, and then sector 1 would be written 4 sectors later. And the reason for that is because it took the CPU so long it was basically the operating system. It took DOS or the operating system so long to read a sector in and decode it from this 5+3 or 6+2 format that 3 other sectors would go by before it was ready for the next sector.
Right.
So effectively, when you load data off of a disk with all these sectors, you're reading it at 1/4 of the bandwidth. So 3 out of 4 sectors is just passing by unread.
Okay.
So I thought that was horrible, and so so basically, once I started a track, I could just immediately read it and pull out all the data in one rotation instead of having to do 4 full rotations to get all the sectors, all the data off the track.
So is this? It sounds like what you're saying is you were creating kind of like your own file system or extending their file system to get a bigger capacity.
Yeah, I was, but that was on earlier products. I didn't do that for Rastan because for Rastan I really wanted it to be hard drive installed, because by 1990 or so my early games were 87, 88, 89, and in that era hard drives weren't super common for the Apple II. But by 1990, hard drives were pretty available and fairly mainstream, and so I wanted to have the data be in standard kind of ProDOS format and be copyable off to the hard drive. So I actually did very little mucking around with the floppy format. The only thing I did, so that was part of my challenge when designing the copy protection system for Rastan, is I wanted it to be, for the most part, a standard format disk with standard data that could be copied anywhere. But I wanted the floppy master to retain a uncopyable signature that could be validated when the game launched.
Okay, so they'd have to have the disk in the drive, even if they launched it from a hard drive.
Right.
Okay.
So the game was set up so you could just copy all the contents of the two floppies onto one folder on your hard drive. It would run from there, and when it came to the copy protection check, it would go check the floppy just for the copy protection signature, and if it passed, then it would continue onward, and if it wouldn't, it would just prompt you to put it in the disk.
Okay.
And again, what the copy protection mechanism were these float bytes, and so what I did is I had in the sync field of one of the tracks sync fields, I wrote I think it was like 4 0 bytes, which meant that when the head tried to read those, it was going to guess. So it was going to try to clock in some ones after enough time had passed, which is what that GCR 6+2 system would do. So it had a shortened window. If it doesn't see a clock bit, it would just guess that there's a 0 there. But after a little bit more time, it would have to put a 1 in. It couldn't go in, couldn't read a 0. It would have to keep clocking stuff in, and so it would always start with a leading 1, and it would kind of clock in varying number of bits at whatever rate the silicon of that drive was running, which varies with temperature and all kinds of other stuff. So it's very variable.
Okay.
So effectively, what the copy protection system on Rastan would do is it would read that sync field, I think it was like 4 times, and then I would get 4 different copies of these 0 bytes. And every time I would read it, I would get a different value, different result, because those values were unstable and they would float. The value, as far as the head was concerned, those bits would float around. And so fundamentally, the copy protection system on Rastan was just to verify that this data pattern in the middle of the sync field was was a set of float bytes that were varying every time. So a copy program would come along, it would read that data, and it would read back valid 6+2 data because the controller had to return data in that valid format.
Oh.
And then it would write it out to the drive. And also because this was in the sync field was usually never copied directly. It was just recognized, this is the sync field, and all that was really copied was the sector headers and the sector data fields.
Okay.
So effectively, this is kind of in it's in the alignment noise area of the track.
Okay.
And so again, it was typically skipped by all the copying programs, particularly 3 and 3.5 inch, copy programs, which weren't as sophisticated as the Apple II 5 1/4 nibble copiers.
Uh-huh.
I think there were some nibble copiers that were made for the 3.5 inch drives eventually, but my memory's a little foggy now.
Yeah, I think Coffee 2 Plus had one that was supposed to be able to do it.
Oh, yeah.
It sounds like that would for sure fail with your scheme, because your scheme relies on getting basically a random read every single time.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, there's no real reason why the copy programs couldn't detect that they were getting random reads, and in that situation, write out invalid bytes, which would then also read randomly. So it was absolutely a copyable system. And in fact, I had a utility program for Rastan that would let me generate that data. I could copy my masters as much as I wanted, but all the standard copy programs would fail. And one wrinkle in this design is that I needed to have low-level nibble access to the track in order to check the copy protection system.
Right.
But a significant number of GS owners had Unidiscs instead of the Apple II disk. I don't remember what it was called. So there was one type of drive that only worked on the Mac, 3.5, and there was another type that would work on a Mac. Or sorry, there was one type that only worked on an Apple II GS, and there was another type that would work on a Mac or a GS. Mm-hmm. And the one that was on the Mac or the GS was called a Unidisc, if I remember correctly, and it had a processor inside. And so that was a big pain in the butt because I effectively had to write a program that would run inside the drive. And then I would have to, so if someone was running Rastan off of a Unidisc, I would detect it was a Unidisc, and then there was a whole smart port protocol that was used to communicate with the external drive, and I would download my code into the drive, and I think it was a 6502 running in the Unidisc, and then so I had to move all my copy protection code over there, and then run it locally, and then return back the result of whether it passed or failed. And so I remember that was a minor nightmare.
Wow.
Anyway, and so then once the copy protection, so once these float bytes were checked, and either they were floating or they were stable, and of course if they were stable, it was a failed protection check. Then I kept prompting the user to put in the master disk. So of course that loop of prompting to put in the master disk was fairly obvious in the code and fairly easy to disable. So that led to the second layer of copy protection in Rastan, which is that I had a time-sliced validation routine that checksummed the entirety of the code. So if any change was made anywhere in the code, Rastan would fail. But it wouldn't fail immediately. It would fail some number of seconds or minutes in the future. So it was very difficult to find out where this checksumming was happening at and disable it. And that was the thing that I think gave a lot of the early people trying to crack Rastan the hardest time, because typically when you crack a program, you just go find out what it's doing and you go change it so it doesn't do that anymore, and it's cracked, right? But with Rastan, any change to the program, and you could continue playing for a few minutes, then it would fail. And there's a couple interesting things about that too. So the way it would fail is once the copy protection check would check a small section of the code every game frame, I think, or maybe every few game frames it would check a small section of the code. So it took it actually quite a while to check all the code, and so but it could take it a while before it detected it. And then once it detected it, it didn't right away trigger the failure case. It waited for a while. So again, there was a long separation between the detection machinery and the failing machinery. And then also the failing machinery I placed on the text page. So if you ever stop the program with with delete or with hitting reset or anything to get a prompt, well, it would clear the text screen and it would blow away the copy protection code. And then and then when the copy protection code got, or when the checksum failure code got triggered, it would make a OS call which would put a message and then have the little bouncing apple. So it was a single BIOS call, or not BIOS, but a single OS call you could make when pass it a string, and it would go into that little bouncing message. And I think it said something like, please stop piracy. It's killing the Apple IIgs market or something. And I had DEAD as the error code, so it was it's killing the GS market dead or something, or making it dead. It's been too long, but anyway. But the funny thing about that is that OS call, of course, one of the things it would do is it would clear the screen to print out that message. So in either case, the code that had triggered the failure case wasn't even around anymore. It was just gone from memory. And so anyway, so yeah, I definitely was having fun with the pirates there, beating on it. And ultimately, the guy that cracked Rastan in that first, it was like in the first week it was out, it got cracked, and he was the guy I knew, and he was a pretty smart guy too, so he kind of took it as a personal challenge. Like, for 3 or 4 days, I think that's all he did was he just this is something in the program, trying to figure out how to climb the Everest that I had thrown out there for him. So it was the game within the game, is kind of how that went down. Yeah. And ultimately what he ended up doing is, so he couldn't find and get around my copy checksumming routine because of all that craziness that I had in there with the big separation in time between the detection failure and then the response, and how the response code was hard to get to and figure out what it was doing and disable it. And so what he ended up doing is he ended up patching ProDOS itself. So he found an OS call that I made to DOS prior to checking the checksum code. So when Rastan called into DOS, he would intercept the call. He would disable my check for the floating bytes. So basically the floating bytes would come back and say, oh, it's a failing, it's not a master, basically. It's failing the float byte check. He would disable that code, but then shortly after there was another ProDOS call. And so when he saw the second ProDOS call come in, he would put the original code back so that my code checksum routine wouldn't fail. So he basically did a short window patch just long enough to bypass my float byte checksum routine and then continue onward. So I thought that was a pretty clever way to circumvent, because even though I checksummed my code, I hadn't checked the OS, basically. And so he patched the OS, which I called. So I thought that was good.
Yeah, that seems like he's kind of cheating, though, because he didn't actually find your code.
That's true. But all's fair in love and war, and protection, I think, pretty much.
Yeah. So when you did the checksum, were you reading like the executable off the disk, or were you checking memory?
Checking the memory, and that was why that was particularly difficult, is because in order to have high performance code, and Rastan really had to be high performance with all the full screen scrolling and stuff. Mm-hmm. High performance code on the 816 pretty much required self-modifying code. So I would say there were hundreds, if not thousands, of loops that were modifying themselves in order to run quickly. And so what all those routines did is they all started out with a known starting case for the address. So they would say, like, load A from 2000, y and store at 2100, y or whatever, right? And I would patch the 2000 and the 2100 to be the source and destination of whatever was needed for that, for that routine. on the fly, and then that loop would run. And then at the end, I would put them back. I put the original constants back. So all my self-modifying code routines in Rastan they would modify and then they would return themselves to their previous state. So that the checksum wouldn't fail.
Well, that's awesome. So
yeah, it was fun.
So do you think that the other, like for example, like I remember Marvel Madness did like a nibble check. Do you think they did a similar check that you did with like the floating bytes, or do you think they just inserted like a specific nibble into like, like the sync bytes somewhere, and we're looking for that? Or do you know what?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. So as far as I can tell, the reason everyone did the bad block check is because it would run on either drive, either the one that had this embedded 6502 controller, or the one that was being directly controlled by the integrated WAS chip in the GS. Uh-huh. So once you go to read disk nibbles, it's a lot harder if you're going to work with the Mac compatible Unidisk. Yeah, so it'd be interesting with Marvel Madness to see if it works with the with the Mac drive. Because maybe it wouldn't. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe it wouldn't. I don't know either. I think probably that game might have come out before the Mac drive. I don't know. I've never heard of this drive that would work on a 2GS or a Mac. So it sounds like you had to deal with like a unique challenge.
Yeah, well, so if I remember correctly, the 3.5 drives for the GS were like gray in color, and they would connect to the back smart port.
Yes.
And then the Mac ones were a white in color.
Oh, okay.
And again, they would also connect. It's just that the WAS chip on the GS wouldn't control the drive directly. It was a communication protocol where DOS would talk to the embedded controller in the drive, and the 6502 in the drive would do all the track nibble, all the disk nibble stuff, and then pass the results back. But yeah, I had both of them, and I wanted them both to work, so I went the extra mile. Which may have been unnecessary, but I just figured it would suck if someone had a Mac-style drive and couldn't play the game because the copy protection system failed.
Yeah, they would be displeased.
Right. But then on the other hand, so my other alternative was to not do the copy protection check on a white drive, in which case anyone that had a white drive could copy the disk to their heart's content, and it would it'd be basically an ineffective copy protection.
Yeah.
So, although the pirate community was so sophisticated at that point that I'm not sure protection really mattered very much anyway. I mean, people circumvented it pretty quickly. So, I mean, it maybe got us a week or two, but that was about it, I think.
So you said you knew the guy, the first guy that cracked the game. Mm-hmm. So were you like friends with the pirate community?
Well, ironically, the GS community was fairly small.
Yeah, it was.
And so really there weren't that many people that were highly competent programmers.
Uh-huh.
And so yeah, I think for the most part, all the good programmers were assembly guys, and if you're programming in assembly, it's pretty easy to look at the assembly programs and other things.
Uh-huh.
So I think it was just kind of the enthusiast community of the day was kind of a hybrid of people that were copying programs, people that were looking at programs, people that were writing programs. It was just, it was just a big hodgepodge, right? Like everyone had copies of things, right? I don't think I knew a single Apple II user who had only purchased software. Like
right.
Everyone had copies of something, right? It was just there was too much stuff out there, and it was all too too varied and informative for people to have purchased copies of everything.
Right.
At least that's the way I remember. But that also might have been the age. And I was like, a teenager basically when I was doing most of my Apple II stuff. So.
Yeah, sure. I remember those days. I remember.
Yeah. Yeah, there'd be parties where people would bring their computers. They'd get together and they would see what program somebody else had that they didn't have, or they would go figure out how is this program working. And there were bulletin boards where people were talking about that stuff all the time. And in fact, a lot of how I ended up learning about the Apple II was a combination of talking to other people via modem and bulletin boards, and then disassembling programs to see how they worked. And part of that, I think, was actually kind of the Apple II culture as well. Like a lot of what I learned was just disassembling DOS and ProDOS, disassembling the basic interpreter, looking at Wozniak's floating point math libraries. I mean, it's just a lot of it was learned by observation of what other people have done.
So do you remember any BBSs that you called back then?
Well, I don't remember their names. I know there was one in Southern California that I called a fair amount, and there was one in Florida. But I don't remember what they were. It's been too long.
I remember there was one in New Jersey. I think it was called the Hidden Stronghold that I called.
Yeah? Yeah, that one sounds familiar.
And they advertised having 100 megs of space. I'm like, holy cow, 100 megs?
How many floppies is that?
And there was one called, I think it was called the Outer Limits, which
that one.
They were affiliated with the East Coast Connection. I don't know if you remember that. I think that was one group that was like trying to crack your game. And it took the guy like 72 hours, and he was like complaining about it. He's like,
exactly.
72 hours is a long time.
That's true. Well, that was the thing. That's probably all people were doing. I mean, they were probably just parked in front of their computer for days, trying to unravel the little tangled knot I gave to them. But like I said, I think it was kind of fun. It was the game within the game.
So did you pay attention to how long it took people to like actually crack it? Were you like watching that?
Not really, because the Super Nintendo had come out, and so in 1990 the Super Nintendo was an A16 based system, and it was far more capable as a gaming platform. And so I was working at NovaLogic at the time, and we had a guy go to Japan, bring back a Super Nintendo with a couple cartridges, and then we desoldered the EEPROM, put in an EEPROM emulator, and then I started right on figuring out how it worked, and basically I reverse engineered Super Mario, and I created an assembler on my Mac to be able to generate 648616 code for the SNES. So yeah, I was pretty busy after Rastan, just kind of getting into the console game space.
Okay, so you went to Super Nintendo development right afterwards.
Right.
That would make sense, because I think Rastan was like one of the last really huge 2GS games. I don't remember like a huge one coming out after that. Maybe Task Force.
Oh, right.
You remember Task Force?
I do, yeah. In fact, so I knew a lot of the guys that did Task Force. They were also kind of enthusiast guys, and that was like kind of their first commercial product before they went off, and I think they went to doing they went to doing games on other platforms, but I don't remember what the platforms were. That was the Visual Concepts guys, I think.
I don't know who they were. I just remember thinking that game was absolutely amazing. Like, holy crap. Like,
I believe those guys are the ones that are doing NBA 2K now. So the old school Apple II guys went and did Madden for many years. So Madden Super Nintendo, and then the whole Madden franchise for EA. And then they also did, and another group of them did Visual Concepts, which did both football and basketball games, and still do basketball games.
Wow, so they're still around.
Yeah.
So, do you remember the 5 1/4-inch version of Prince of Persia?
Yeah, that was cool.
Are you familiar with the copy protection technique they used for that one?
I have no idea. No, I didn't know that one.
I think they actually came up with a new file system where they could store 18. I think it was 18 sectors per track instead of 16.
Okay.
Which basically meant that you couldn't, as long as they maximized the disk space, it was impossible to copy it because the conventional disk couldn't hold enough space.
Well, yeah. So we actually did stuff like that at Datasoft too. So you could there was a potentiometer on the drive where you could slow down. You could control the drive speed.
Oh yeah.
And so so we had a bunch of products early on at Datasoft where we used the slow. It was a slow write was the protection system.
Uh-huh.
So you slow down the drive a little bit, and then that lets you write more data to it. And because the read system will auto clock in the bits based on the clock bits and data bits being interleaved.
Uh-huh.
That so if you slow down when you write, when you read at normal speed, the data comes in faster. But as long as it doesn't come in too fast, the read system can still decode it properly.
Okay.
But then if you go to try to write it on a normal speed drive, you can't. It won't write out that. It's more data than you can write out. But if you open up your drive and you turn the pot down, then you can actually get it all the way around. Like the nibble copier will be able to write it all the way around. So it's not as hard to defeat that protection system as some other systems, because all you have to do is know that the track has got too much data, which means you need to slow your drive down with the pot. But yeah, I'm not sure how many people were that sophisticated to.
Probably not too many.
Right.
So when these discs went off to like the manufacturer to like be mass produced, how did they mass produce them? Did you like provide them with like a program to like create the disc?
Well, so that's kind of a funny story. So when I got my first job in the programming industry, is at Datasoft. I was 18. It was a big warehouse in the San Fernando Valley, and the front half of it, when you walk in on the left side, it was an office building with a drop ceiling, and there was a bunch of people in there programming and doing some art and doing some testing and stuff. And then on the right half was a warehousing company and a disk manufacturing company, the offices for them. And then the whole back half of the warehouse was the warehousing and the disk manufacturing facility. So it was basically like 4 quarters in this big warehouse building. And Datasoft effectively had multiple companies under their umbrella, and then they would do everything. So they would warehouse stuff, largely their own products. They would manufacture. So they had a whole bunch of Apple IIs with modified floppy drives and like big stacks of them. So they had 6 or 8 drives on every Apple II. And then so the other thing that was kind of funny is in the back of the warehouse there was roll-up doors, and right behind the roll-up doors was the train, and they would put all the copied products on the train, which would drive them up to EA for distribution all around the world. So it was just kind of nuts as kind of a young kid starting out in the industry to see all these moving parts all under one roof. And basically it went from people typing to stuff in a box that you would buy at a store and just put on a train and off it goes. Yes, that was pretty wild. And my first product, Datasoft, was Tomahawk, a flight simulator, one of the few flight simulators for the 2 or 2GS. And I remember I had a bug on it, and I've been working on the bug there was 2 or 3 bugs. I was down to one last kind of major bug, and I've been working on it over the weekend. But Monday morning, the manufacturing guys came in from the back door into the office area, and they're like, okay, I need the master so I can start manufacturing, because we have to put it on the train, end of the day or whatever. And I'm like, well, I'm still trying to find this bug. And they're like, well, we have to make 2,000 discs, so I need that disc now because it's take us several hours to manufacture it, right? And so I reluctantly gave them what I had, knowing that it had this crash bug in it, and it wasn't really the right thing, right? But talk about, as a programmer, kind of it's kind of the fear of God thing. It's like, okay, well, your bug is being manufactured right now and putting onto all these discs. They're going to go in boxes and people are going to buy them, So I really should probably fix that bug. So it took me 2 more hours to find it and fix it. And then we had to have this powwow meeting with the head of Datasoft, the head of the manufacturing group, and the head of engineering and myself, where I'm like, okay, here's the bug. I got a fix for it. I'm pretty sure this is it. How many? And then they had to have this whole discussion of, how many discs have we manufactured? And we're back there, and the production guy looks over and he's got this stack of discs, and he's like, well, we're gonna lose 2 hours if we redo them all. And so, but they decided to redo them, and I think they, instead of shipping out 1,000 at the end of the day, they just shipped 500 or whatever the number was, right? They ended up doing a smaller initial shipment, and then they made up for it later. But yeah, it was just kind of crazy, the whole on the fly process of code, debug, test, duplicate, stuff it in a box, put it in the pallet, put it on the train, off it goes. So yeah, some craziness. But yeah, but those drives on the Apple II, so they had so the floppy disks had a hole in them that would show you where track 0 was, or sector 0. And Apple IIs didn't have a sensor for that, but our drives did. And why that was useful is that we could do synchronized tracks, which was a copy protection scheme where you read one sector and then you immediately sync to another track and start reading. So the tracks, the data from track to track is synced relative to each other.
Oh.
So Locksmith and one of those copy protection systems, they'll read the source track a bunch of times so they can figure out what it is, and they'll write it down, and then they'll go to the next track and they'll read it a bunch of times and they'll write it. But the writing of the second track is not oriented relative to the first track.
Oh.
And that loss of orientation will be checked for, and it will cause a failure in the. And there was actually some apps some programs where they would have spiral tracks, so they would just read the data in a spiral. So it was more of like a continuous thing, because it was all magnetic substrate on the disk. And the tracks were really just whatever the stepping motor for the head was deciding that it should be.
Mm-hmm. And those definitely had to be in sync with each other, I guess.
Yeah.
Man, I'm really sorry to hear about this, because a friend and we've been talking about making like a little piece of hardware to like read the disk 2 disk 2 drive, so that we can like extract the bits off of the disk.
Mm-hmm.
And like we're trying to think of, okay, what do we need to do to like really preserve everything on this disk? And I said, do you think we need to have the tracks in sync with each other? Because that would be a real pain to try to do that. I'm like, let's just so we don't need to make the tracks in sync. But now you just shattered my plan.
Yeah. Well, it depends on. Some production systems don't care and others do care, right? So it depends. But yeah, ideally, ideally the synchronization would be maintained, or it would have to be reasonably close to be maintained. But see, the thing is, the good news now is, back in that era, part of the challenge for copy programs is they never knew what people were going to do next, right? Well, now there's really not any. There's no more new stuff, right? All the protection systems have been done. They're all ancient history, and so now it's just a question of representing that finite subset of approaches. And as far as I can tell, the ones that weren't well represented by the copy programs back in the day were the track-to-track synchronization, the speed variance issues, and the floating bytes. As far as I know, those three are the three kind of holes that professional game developers mostly leaned upon, because the copy programs weren't sophisticated enough. But nowadays, that would be relatively easy to recognize those schemes and to copy with integrity those approaches, I think.
Well, the floating byte one sounds like it might be kind of difficult, because it sounds like the drive won't actually. What was the thing that inserted the ones? Was it the drive controller, or was it the drive itself?
It was the drive controller. So the controller had a self-block mechanism that would put in ones if it hadn't seen a one coming in off the drive within a certain time period.
So if we just hooked up directly to the drive, then we'd get the actual bits. We wouldn't have to worry about those ones being inserted.
Yeah, probably. But even if you use a regular Apple II drive to read the bits off the drive, if you read the track multiple times, which Locksmith and all the copy programs would do anyway, and if there were regions that were varying, then you could infer that those were floating byte regions.
Oh, yeah. And
you could recreate them by writing zeros, or a similarly illegal unstable pattern for the drive, which would again cause the drive head to float in how it interpreted that region of the drive.
Oh, okay. Well, that's really cool.
Yeah, like I said, there's a lot of information here, so I'm not, probably good to get it recorded just so that it could be preserved one way or the other.
Yeah. Because that's the reason I contacted you, is because we want to make a piece of hardware that will hook up to like a disk drive and then read all the bits.
Mm-hmm.
But the 3.5-inch disc, it seems like that has some kind of controller built into it. Like, it doesn't seem like you can read just raw bits off that thing. It seems like you can read raw bits.
Yep. Yeah. So it really is just it uses the exact same GCR encoding that the floppy drive used. The difference is that the floppy drive had a constant rotation speed, whereas the actually, it was a constant rotation speed. So the difference on the 3.5s is that it has more sectors on the outer tracks than it has on the inner tracks. So the larger circumference of the outer track allows more sectors to be packed in there.
Right. Yeah.
So I think what it was doing is it was slowing down the rotation speed. It had like 3 or 4 speed bands, and so every few tracks, the number of sectors would increase as you go from the inner ring to the outer ring.
Right.
But the actual nibbles on the disc and how they're read and stuff, and the 6.2 decoding, I think all that was pretty much the same.
Okay. Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, and the number of tracks is higher. So instead of 35 tracks, I think it's like 80 tracks or something.
Right. Yeah, that sounds right. So I have a question about the 3200 color stuff that you did.
Yep.
So you first introduced that for your Tomahawk game.
Right.
Did anyone else, do you know of anyone else who started tinkering around with that afterwards?
Well, I know someone actually made a paint program that would work in that mode.
Yeah. Dream Graphics, I think it was called.
Yeah, so I think that took a couple of years because it was kind of a gnarly mode to try to support.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, so what I was originally trying to do is I was trying to race the beam kind of like the old 8-bit Nintendo system. Like with the old Nintendo, pretty much the CPU is drawing the pixels as the beam is going. So there's like a register saying, what the brightness is or whatever. And the 6502 was like writing values into there, which was changing the color as the beam scans across. So for the most part, on like the old 8-bit Nintendo, the game logic runs in VBlank because during the screen it's busy like drawing pixels effectively.
Really?
Yeah, and so I was trying to, it's crazy. So I was
like
trying
a horrible
to do
design.
yeah, pretty much. But when I tried to do it on the GS, I realized, so I was trying to change the palettes because that's a small amount of data that affects all the pixels on the screen. So I wanted to do some palette animation cycling and kind of some racing the beam stuff. Anyway, and what I found was that the palettes are latched, they're read in and latched by the hardware in the horizontal blank. So before the hardware draws a scan line, it reads the SCB byte and it reads the palette associated with the SCB and it holds them in on-chip registers. And then it reads the pixel data out of the frame buffer and draws the line.
Okay.
So I really couldn't race the beam very effectively because it was all being preloaded into the display chip.
Uh-huh.
But what was interesting about that is because it was reading at every H blank, it meant that I could, if as long as I changed it a line or two ahead of time, I could change it every single scan line. And so then why that was interesting is then I could basically have unique colors every scan line and effectively have 3200 colors with a unique set of 16 every scan line.
Right.
And I just used the different palettes. So I would change them like 16 at a time. I would have palette 15 be used for the first and then palette 0 be used for the last. And then, so it would be reading those palettes. And then after it had used 15 was going on to the lower palette numbers, I would be pushing more colors in to change palette 15 entries. And so I would kind of follow along. It was reading out of the palettes in descending order, and I was pushing new data out in descending order, following behind. And so I could effectively have 200 different palettes for the 200 scan lines. And that let me take pictures that were real photographs or other things that were much higher, visual quality than what you guys could normally display with 16 colors.
Uh-huh.
But that was just kind of a hobby thing. I think I put out in the public domain or whatever a couple of sets of images that I'd pulled down from the Amiga or ST or something, and then converted over to the 3200 color format.
Uh-huh.
It was just kind of a slideshow. And then later on, people took the technique and started doing editors and stuff.
Yeah, but it seems like since the CPU has to constantly be working, you can't really do anything except just display a static picture.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to remember on Tomahawk. So the other thing that you can do with the SCBs is you could get an interrupt on any given scan line. And so when I first implemented it, I believe I did it with interrupts. And so I think it took about half of the CPU time to change the 16 palettes for a 16 scanline region. So which meant I had the other half of the CPU time still left available. So I believe for the title screen of Tomahawk, I was decompressing audio and sending it to the Ensoniq chip, and then while I was changing the palettes. So the palettes would be interrupt driven. So I'd get an interrupt every 16 scan lines, and I would push another set of 16 palettes through. Or maybe it was 8. I think I would do 8 at a time, kind of a double buffered system. And once I returned from the interrupt handler every 8 scan lines, the rest of the time I had available to just keep decompressing audio and push it over to the Ensoniq.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so I think I had streamed music running, and I think I was streaming that music in off the floppy drive too. So that's where I had I think I had the 924 sector format for that. But yeah, so my memory's a little fuzzy. That was a while back, but but yeah, there was definitely just changing the palettes. I think only took about half the CPU time.
Oh, so I didn't know that you could have interrupts get triggered on the scan lines. I mean, I don't really know too much about what pins the 816 has, but I know the 6502 has just like an IRQ and an NMI interrupt.
Yeah.
So I assumed the H16 would be kind of the same thing, but it sounds like they have a little bit more interrupt capabilities.
Well, yes, but the graphics chip had it was an IRQ that you would get, and then once you got an IRQ, there was a set of possible hardware sources in the GS that could generate an interrupt. So the serial ports could generate it, the smart port for the floppy drive could generate it, the video controller, I don't remember what it's called now, but anyways, that could generate on scan lines or VBlank. I think there's a VBlank and there's one for every scan line that you could get. And so like when you got a scan line interrupt, it wouldn't tell you which scan line had generated the interrupt. You would just have to read the scan line counter and go, okay, what scan line am I on? And
so basically, when you get an interrupt, you have to like first figure out what caused the interrupt before you can do anything with it.
Right. And then you usually have to clear. So each interrupt, each hardware that could generate interrupts also had a different register you'd have to write to clear the interrupt. So yeah. So if somebody generated an interrupt in your handler, you'd have to pull all the different sources, find out who it was, do whatever you were going to do to handle the interrupt, and then clear the interrupt source. And then when you return from interrupt, if one of the other pieces of hardware had generated another interrupt, the interrupt line would still be low. You'd come right back in, and then you'd have to go pull everybody again. Okay, now who is it, right? And so you service all the different sources of IRQs. Yeah. And actually, one thing I was going to mention. So I thought more about the Space Ace stuff I was doing, and I realized that I didn't have the video capture on the GS. I had a Mac back in the 90s, and so I'm pretty sure I captured the video source from the Macintosh, and then I took the video data and I sent it over to the GS, and then that's where I was playing it back from. I would pick as much of it as I could fit into the 8 megs of memory because I had an octa RAM on my GS, and so I could load an 8 meg segment up, and then and then play back basically a few seconds. I don't remember if it was 10 seconds or
not
8
very
seconds.
much.
Yeah, it wasn't very much, but I thought it certainly was. It was so I thought it was possible to compress the video data such that you could get a pretty healthy segment of Space Ace or Dragon Slayer, on the GS. But and that was an area that I thought would be cool and wasn't really well represented because there was almost no video. I mean, like video was just not even really an option, or no one even considered it an option on the GS. So, but it was very cool to see those games, and also the logic for those games was so simple that you could certainly run the logic to see if someone's hitting the direction at the right window of time. You run that logic in VBlank or whatever with no problem, and spend the rest of your time just decompressing and pushing video frames through into the video memory.
Yeah.
But yeah, I never kind of completed it, and I got pulled into Super Nintendo and and then other things. But yeah, that.
So I forgot if you answered this. Did you ever see the official Space Ace released by ReadySoft for the 2GS?
No, I don't think I did. No, so someone actually made the full game out for it.
Well, it wasn't really the full game. It was like literally like 9 floppies,
Oh, geez.
and each scene would last like 5 seconds or something. So you'd like play a scene, then you have to wait for it to load, play a scene, then
Oh,
like
no.
change discs, and they would only, the backgrounds were always static, so they'd take scenes where the background didn't move, and they would just animate like the foreground.
Okay.
So
they altered the movie a bit then in order to make that work, I assume.
they did what?
They altered the video quite a bit in order to make it work on the GS.
I think they just focused on the scenes where the background didn't move, because there were a lot of scenes where the background didn't move, but there were some scenes where it was like, like going through like a checkerboard tunnel, and the tunnel's like animated. That they would never try to attempt that.
Right.
But I remember thinking that it was pretty amazing what they accomplished. But it sounds like what you were dabbling with was quite a bit more impressive.
Well, yeah. I mean, I should look. I guess I should probably look and see what they were doing. But yeah, I was trying to do a full video codec where I decompress the entire video frame and send it to the screen every time. Although the other thing is that I believe the entire video frame for the capture I had was less than full screen size. I think it was like a 1/4 screen, like 160 by 100 or something. Oh. The cameras in those early 90s, I think, were less than 320 200 generally, because they didn't have very much bandwidth coming in off of an image capture device.
Right.
But yeah, I definitely think the platform was capable of some lower res video playback, but I guess no one just got there in time, basically.
Yeah, it pretty much collapsed. It just seems unfortunate that like when Apple made the 2GS, they didn't add things like double buffering or like adding some kind of hardware to like copy RAM really fast, stuff like that.
Yeah, that totally would have did it. Yeah, so that was the other thing, is like no one thought you could even do a scrolling game on it when I was first doing Rastan, and I showed a early demo of it at CES in like I think '89, and it just got everyone's attention. Yeah, and then so what I ended up doing there, just as some more background, is I did a series of tests on how fast I could write to video memory.
Uh-huh.
And so the deal was that the whole video output system was largely carried over from the original Apple II, which meant that it was like a 1 megahertz clock. But the Apple II like had a stretch clock. The clock wasn't at a regular pace. It was kind of synchronized with the color burst of NTSC.
Uh-huh.
And so it's just some tricky timing, and it's really kind of keyed around a nominal 1 megahertz clock. Anyway, so on the GS, they kept all that for compatibility and just didn't have to re-engineer it all. But that meant that the 2.8 megahertz 65/816 had to slow down to about 1 megahertz whenever it wrote to the I/O memory, kind of the Apple II side of the world.
Uh-huh.
And so what that meant was that your 2.8 megahertz processor runs at 1 megahertz a lot of the time if you're spending a lot of your time trying to get stuff to the screen. And so so the first thing I remember trying was using the MVN MVP instructions, which were opcodes that purported to actually move data around, but they were 7 cycles a byte or 14 cycles a word. And if you try to move data from E1 2000 somewhere else in E1 2000, the read and the write are both coming at 1 megahertz, right? So the CPU is just like horribly stalled.
But didn't they have like a setting where you could like write to like bank 1 instead of bank E1, and it was supposed to run faster?
Yeah. So and the major advantage there was not so much that the write was faster, but that the reads were faster.
Oh.
So like for Rastan, being able to read from 2.8 megahertz memory instead of reading from 1 megahertz memory, that was of course the big win there. But on the writes would still pass through up to bank E1, which is 1 megahertz clock speed memory.
Okay.
But even then, so the key deal there is that if you write to that memory in bytes, you're kind of screwed because you have to synchronize the 2.8 gigahertz or 2.8 megahertz clock and the 1 megahertz clock. Yeah, I go to gigahertz nowadays. Yeah, so anyway, you had to synchronize the two clocks, which effectively means that you lockstep up at 1 megahertz. And so you would get 1 byte write at 1 megahertz, and then you would get an instruction fetch at 2.8, and maybe do some other work at 2.8. And by the time you're ready to do your next 1 megahertz memory access, you've missed that window of time, right? And so effectively, you're only writing at every other 1 megahertz interval. And so these going into 16-bit mode. So in 16-bit mode, because the 65816 is doing the 2 8-bit writes kind of back to back as adjacent bus cycles, you'll always get a pair of 1 megahertz writes to bank E1, and then you'll lose a cycle. So if you're fast, you only lose 1 cycle. If you're doing a bunch of other stuff, you can lose 2 or 3 cycles. And so that was the kind of the key thing is I found that if you can write 3 cycles per byte, or 6 cycles per word, then you'll get 2 1 megahertz cycles that you write to, and then only one megahertz cycle that you go idle, that you aren't accessing the memory bus. So you get 2 and 3 cycles. But then if you go slower than 6 cycles, which is 3 cycles a byte, so 6 cycles per word, 3 cycles per byte. So it's basically 3 cycles per byte, you waste 1 megahertz cycle. 4 cycles per byte, you waste 2, and then 5.5 cycles, you waste 3. And then the default memory move was 7 cycles, which was just incredibly horribly slow. Anyway, and so most of the instructions in the 65816 instruction set were extended versions of the 6502 instruction set, and the problem with that is they would add extra cycles to do 16-bit operations because they were designed to do 8 or 16, and so they would go slower doing 16. But all the instructions, there were a few instructions that were added specifically for the 816. They were always processing 16-bit data, and as a result, they were more efficient fundamentally than the variable width 6502 instructions. And so the two I used most for Rastan was PEA and PEI. And the PEA was a 1-byte opcode and then 16 bits of constant data, and it would push it onto the stack. And so by putting the stack onto the super high-res frame buffer memory, and then pushing constant data onto it, that's how everything gets drawn on Rastan. So all the screen tiles and all the sprites, they're all pushes onto the stack of constant data.
Holy cow!
Yeah, and then the scrolling, those are all PEIs. And so what the PEI was designed to do is it was designed to take a 16-bit address of something that you have in your 0 page and put it on the stack, so you can use that 0 page and you can restore it later. But what I did is I put the 0 page or the direct page, I would put it at one place on my screen, and then I put the stack on another place on my screen. So the direct page would be my source, and then the stack would be my destination. And then I would push, do the PEI, which would pick up 2 bytes from direct page and then put them on the stack. And so the PEI would basically load 2 bytes and store 2 bytes and do it all in 6 cycles.
Wow.
And the fastest I could do it with a low store was like 8 cycles or 10 cycles, which meant I would idle another 1 or 2 1 megahertz clock, bus clocks in the video memory. So that was the big win. And then a couple other things that were kind of noteworthy about that system is, so when you're scrolling the screen, like you say, when Rastan, the player is generally running to the right, and so the whole screen has to scroll to the left. And there's no page flipping, so all the pixels are visible on the fly as the game is running. So for the scrolling piece, I needed to deal with the fact that if I if I was moving scan lines over from top of the screen to the bottom of the screen, the video refresh would catch me partway through, and I would get a big tear.
Yep.
In the middle of the screen.
Yeah.
So instead, I ended up with I think like 8 different scrolling routines, and each scrolling routine would move the data along the axis of the scroll. So when you're scrolling to the right, or when you're scrolling to the left, running to the right, I would pick up data. I would pick up a column of pixels, and I would copy it to the left, and then I would move over and pick up a column of pixels and overwrite the one I just moved. So I was basically moving columns across. So when the beam caught me partway through, there'd be a column that had a little tear in it, but the tear was localized to the column. All the columns to the left were already fully moved, and all the columns to the right were not yet moved. And so it was far more visually stable. The tears would be small and localized, and you can see playing Rastan, because I think it runs at like 15 or 20 frames a second generally, which usually means it takes 2 or 3 frames for it to do a scroll, and you'll see there's kind of a rubber banding effect as it's scrolling, where it's moved some columns over, and the refresh comes through and shows you the partial movement, and so part of the screen is wider effectively, and then and then the rest of it will catch up later. So yeah, I had custom scroll routines for left, right, up, down, and the diagonals. And then some other kind of crazy thing about the rendering system was that so part of the problem there is trying to touch as few bytes as possible for the sprites. So it took most of the time just to scroll the screen, and but the problem was I also needed to I also need to update what was on the screen, all the sprite stuff, and so I did all that as kind of an off-screen buffer operation in Bank 1. So I would start with just the tiles with no sprites on them, for wherever the player was in the screen, and then when I wanted to draw sprites, every sprite. So first of all, I had a thing which I called code sprites. So I took every sprite and I loaded it in generated 2 functions for every sprite. So one function was the backsave function. Actually, it might even had 3 functions. Let me see what. No, I think it was just 2. So I had one function that would draw, I think it would save and draw, and then I had another one that would restore. So effectively, what was going on is that, let's say we wanted to draw Rastan somewhere on the screen. Actually, maybe I did have 3 functions. It's been too long. So I'm going to go with the 3 function description because there's nothing else that's actually easier. I might have combined the save and the draw together. But anyway, conceptually, there's 3 different steps that need to happen. First, I need to take all the pixels that are going to be modified that are underneath Rastan, and I need to have those. So what I didn't want to do is have to redraw the tiles to erase a character. So instead, what I did is all the pixels under a character, I'd save it away, and I would draw all the pixels that correspond to Rastan, and then once I had drawn that frame, I would then take my saved pixels and I would draw them back where they were, effectively erasing the Rastan sprite.
Okay.
So a sprite process consisted of save the background, draw the sprite, and then erase the sprite by restoring the background.
Okay.
And anyway, and all those were functions. So what I would effectively do is I would look at the bit patterns for Rastan, and there'd be a whole bunch of transparencies, say, to the left of his head, and then there'd be a few pixels of his head. And so rather than trying to have a big rectangular block of the pixel data for the sprite, instead I just had a function I would generate, which would say load 16-bit constant, which was 4 pixels, and store it in memory, either with a push to the stack or with a store to direct page. I remember exactly which way I did it. I think I did it with a push, the PEA stuff. Mm-hmm. So I would set the stack to the right edge of the pixel data, and I would just push it for that scan line. And then similarly, the restore routine would load the data up that had been saved, the background map that had been saved previously, and it would push it back over there to erase it. So So in bank 1, I would start with the blank image, and I would put all my sprites on it, and then the scrolling routine would effectively pick all the data up, move it over, and by writing it back, it would copy it up to bank E1. Mm-hmm. So all my sprite drawing was done with shadowing disabled, and then the scrolling routine would effectively put it up to the slow memory. Oh. And then after I'd copied up to the slow memory, then I erased all my sprites by taking the back saved version of the playfield and putting all those bytes back over to erase my sprites. So that was basically the process for a frame, was save background, draw sprites, scroll screen, then restore background over the sprites.
So it seems like you'd have to deal with the sprites flickering unless you were careful.
Well, so that's why all the sprite draw and restore work was done with the shadow writes disabled.
Oh, okay.
So they were all happening at 2.8 megahertz directly into bank 01 memory. Mm-hmm. Although, so I was shadowing bank 01 into bank 0, but I was not shadowing bank 01 to E1.
Oh.
So all the sprite draw restore work was done, only to bank 1. And then in the scrolling routine was shadowing all writes from bank 1 to bank E1. So they would actually go into video memory and show up on the screen.
Okay. So in order for it to actually show up on the screen, the scrolling routine would have to be called. Right.
Yeah, so even if you were just standing there doing nothing, I would have to do basically a full screen blit to read all the pixels from bank 1 and write them back to themselves. Okay. Basically a null scroll operation. just in order to get all those bytes to get sent up to E1 and show up on the screen. Yeah, it was a crazy platform.
So did you ever know any other developers from like other companies like Will Harvey, like Zany Golf, The Immortal? Because I know they had to deal with scrolling issues. I'm just wondering if they use similar techniques or if you know.
Yeah, I don't know of anyone else. So I think I was the first to develop a lot of those techniques. So I knew the guys that did Task Force and the Alien Mind guys. Uh-huh. So I worked with Robin Carr and Matt Crysdale, the guys that did Alien Mind, mm-hmm. to reverse engineer the 2GS 3.5-inch drive controller. Ah. So both Tomahawk and Alien Mind came out around the same time, and we both had custom floppy disk formats. So we kind of shared knowledge about how the drive hardware worked and how the OS used the drive. Mm-hmm. And we both had denser formats and faster load time. So we didn't have the 4. So one track rotation would give us all of our data for both Tomahawk and Alien Mind, which is the thing I talked about before, mm-hmm. of avoiding the the sector read. And I think even on Rasteon, I might have had my own DOS where I could read the whole track, even though it was a 4-to-1 interleave. I would read all 4 sectors, and so when past the track, I would read all the sectors out of order and just store them away, and then I would decode them separately, so I could have a 4 times faster load time than ProDOS would do.
So okay, so I was actually curious about that. Is that the reason why like certain demos from like FTA could load super fast because mm-hmm. they were like just reading the raw bytes, and that's also the reason why if you use the regular operating system calls, the reads are so incredibly slow.
Yeah, because the regular operating system was running. It would take it 4 rotations of the drive, of the platter before it got all the data off the track. So it was effectively reading at 1/4 speed. Yeah, it was just horrible. I mean, and there was a lot of things about the software in that Apple IIgs era which just seemed, it left a lot to be desired. So the way that the GSOS, like the windowing system, the menus, the windows, all the graphics blitting routines, they were, super generic and super inefficient, and I just remember kind of being frustrated by the slowness of the response of the system, and it seemed unnecessary just because the system had faster pathways to move stuff around. It's just the OS didn't use them. And and I don't know if that was because of overly conservative software development practices, or maybe there were legitimate reasons why you needed a 4-to-1 sector interleave, or you needed the slower drawing routines. And I was just dealing with a constrained enough subset of situations in my programming interaction that I could get away with shortcuts effectively. I mean, I never really understood what the full set of requirements were that these other I don't know what requirements prompted these other guys to do things the way they did, or if they just didn't know where the fast paths were through the system.
I'm gonna go for the second one.
Yeah, more likely probably.
So, do you still have the source code?
I do. I don't throw anything away. I have a storage facility with lots of stuff in it, and I haven't probably booted the GS up in over 10 years. So it's probably actually closer to 20 years now that I think about it. Yeah. It's been a long time. So I have no idea if it even works or not. But yeah, one of these days I'll have to dig it out and see if it works and what it does.
All right.
So do you have a working GS system?
Why, yes, I do. It's right here.
All right. Very cool.
Yeah, I recently got back into it. Cause I want to.
Yeah, I've got. I think I had a transwarp, like a 7 megahertz or something, or 9 megahertz, something crazy, and then I also had a DMA SCSI controller card that I remember was just blazingly fast. So I mean, I remember actually by the kind of early to mid 90s there, the Apple II was a pretty peppy system if you stayed in text mode. Like I think I had the guy that did Merlin, he had some program launcher. I don't remember what it's called, ProCell maybe.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I remember I used that and the caching SCSI controller card. I turned the machine on and it would just boot up to that main menu in about half a second or something.
Really?
Yeah, it was super fast, and then I would I could basically run back and forth between the programs, and they would each just take a half second or a second to launch, because they would all just come in off the hard drive super fast, and they would be DMA'd right in the memory, so none of the 6502 copying stuff around. But yeah.
Wow, because I had a SCSI card, probably not the fancy one you're talking about, and just a regular hard drive, and I recently replaced it with compact flash adapter.
Oh, really? Okay.
Which I thought would be like super fast, but when I booted it up, it was just meh. Of course, I don't have like the transwarp, so it's probably CPU limited, but yeah, it was slower than I expected.
Yeah. Well, the other thought I had recently was that with all these new inexpensive like single board computers, I wonder how hard it would be to actually make a board that would plug in to the 6502 40-pin DIP socket and emulate the entire processor in software using a modern microcontroller.
Probably not hard.
Yeah.
But what would that get you to do that? Could you make it faster?
Yeah, so you could make it faster, probably tens if not hundreds of megahertz. So you could make it crazy fast if you wanted. The other thing you could do is you could use video out, USB out, Ethernet out, wireless out. I mean, you could do a bunch of stuff to give alternate I/O capabilities kind of directly out through the CPU instead of having to rely upon plug-in boards and stuff. So you could pretty thoroughly modernize an Apple platform, I think, with with one of these Raspberry Pis, or like there's a Kickstarter for the chip with a $9 part that has Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and stuff. So it'd probably be a bunch of software, and it may need to be a little bit of hardware to interface the 40-pin DIP package into a form that you can communicate and drive all those pins. But it seems like it should be possible to emulate a CPU with in software nowadays at at 6502 speeds.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, plus basically.
Yeah, but it's my understanding that even if you made the CPU like super fast, you'd still have to like slow it down to talk to like the memory and the disk drives and stuff, wouldn't you?
Yeah, well, certainly for the disk drives you would. For the memory, you could choose whether you want to use the memory outside the CPU or not. So you could effectively cache the RAM. I mean, assuming you don't have a DMA controller in the system. If you have a DMA controller, then well, even with a DMA controller, assuming that you can watch the address bus being changed by the DMA controller, you can realize that it's DMAing and provide the data yourself, presumably. Yeah, and again, I don't know. I'm not enough of a hardware guy to know all the ins and outs of what's going on there, but it just seems like modern systems are so much more powerful and sophisticated than back in the day that it seems like you can do software emulation for what used to have to be done in hardware.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. In fact, a friend and I talked about, hey, we should just take a FPGA and make a new Apple IIgs, except make it much faster and better memory. And I got all excited. I'm like, okay, I got to finish my Laserdisc replacement project first. Can't keep can't keep starting new projects and not finishing old ones. Mm-hmm. But that would definitely be fun.
Can you tell me a little bit about the Laserdisc replacement? So what happens with that? Is it you provide the video and the interface, or does it still work with a Laserdisc, or what's happening there? All right. Well, I should probably hit the road or get back to things. But if you have any more questions about copy protection stuff or Rastan or whatever, certainly happy to help.
All right.
Do these conversations pretty easily. I'll look forward to that email on the Laserdisc stuff. I want to see if I can get that over to John and help him fix his broken Laserdisc player.
Okay, I'll look for a few YouTube links.
Okay.
And send it over to you.
That'd be cool. Yeah, and also please let me know when you're going to be in town, so that'd be neat to get together.
All right. Sounds great. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, good talking to another fellow Apple enthusiast from back in the day.
All right.
All right, later, man.
Talk to you later.
This has been the Open Apple Podcast. Subscribe to us in iTunes or visit us at open-apple.net, where you can browse our extensive catalogue of past episodes or read our blog. If you like what you've heard today, or even if you didn't, your comments, questions or ideas are always welcome. Send them to feedback@open-apple.net.